The name Rockefeller carried the weight of an empire. It was a dynasty forged in the fires of American industry, a name synonymous with unimaginable wealth, political influence, and philanthropic power. John D. Rockefeller, the patriarch, had built Standard Oil into a global titan, reshaping the very fabric of modern capitalism. His descendants inherited not just his fortune but a world that bent to their will. They were the closest thing America had to royalty, their lives chronicled and scrutinized, their every move shaping policy, art, and society. To be a Rockefeller was to be born into a legacy of immense privilege and equally immense expectation. A life lived under the brightest of spotlights, where every path seemed paved with gold and every door was open. Within this powerful dynasty was Nelson Rockefeller, a formidable figure in his own right. He was the governor of New York, a man who moved with an unshakable confidence through the corridors of power, destined, many believed, for the presidency. His ambition was as vast as the family fortune, yet his son Michael Clark Rockefeller was different. He was a young man who seemed to carry the family name with a certain unease. While his father collected modern masterpieces from Picasso and Mondrian, Michael was drawn to something far more elemental, something raw and ancient. He felt a pull not toward the polished boardrooms of Manhattan, but toward the untamed, distant corners of the world, places untouched by the long reach of his family's influence. Michael was a recent Harvard graduate, thoughtful and introspective, with a quiet passion for anthropology. He possessed a yearning for authenticity, a desire to find meaning beyond the gilded cage of his upbringing. His father had established the Museum of Primitive Art, a testament to his own interest in non-Western cultures, and it was here that Michael found his calling. He was not merely a collector, he was a student of humanity, fascinated by the intricate belief systems and artistic expressions of societies that existed on the fringes of the modern world. He wanted to understand these cultures from the inside, to see the world through their eyes, and to preserve a piece of their legacy before it vanished forever. This quest for the primitive was more than an academic pursuit, it was a personal rebellion. It was a journey away from the predictable trajectory of a Rockefeller scion, a life of business, politics, and high society. Michael sought a world where his famous name meant nothing, where his survival and success would depend solely on his own courage, wit, and empathy. He was drawn to the idea of an adventure that was truly his own, a narrative he could write for himself, far from the shadow of his father and the immense weight of his family's history. It was this powerful, almost spiritual drive that would lead him to one of the most remote and mysterious places on Earth, the island of New Guinea. In 1961, Michael Rockefeller embarked on his second expedition to what was then known as Netherlands, New Guinea. This vast remote island, cloaked in dense primordial jungle and carved by powerful rivers, was one of the last frontiers of exploration. It was home to hundreds of distinct tribes, many of whom had little to no contact with the outside world. For an aspiring anthropologist and art collector like Michael, it was a living museum, a place of profound discovery. His mission was specific and ambitious: to acquire a significant collection of Asmat art for his father's museum. The Asmat people were renowned for their powerful and spiritually charged wood carvings, and Michael was determined to assemble a collection that would be unparalleled in its scope and quality. His motivation, however, went far deeper than mere acquisition. Michael was not a treasure hunter in the traditional sense. He was an ethnographer at heart. He learned to speak the local trade languages and approached the Asmat people with a genuine respect and curiosity that was rare among outsiders at the time. He traded for their artifacts not with money, which had little meaning there, but with steel axes, tobacco, and fish hooks, items that held practical value. He documented his journey with a camera, capturing stunning and intimate portraits of the people he met. He was fascinated by their complex cosmology, their rituals, and the central role that art played in mediating their relationship with the spirit world. The Asmat carvings Michael sought were not simply decorative objects. They were conduits to the ancestral realm, created as part of elaborate ceremonies that governed every aspect of life and death. The intricately carved Bisjay poles, towering memorials to the recently deceased, were particularly significant. These poles were created to appease the spirits of those who had been killed, often in raids by enemy villages. They served as a solemn promise that their deaths would be avenged, a necessary act to restore balance to the cosmos. Michael understood this context. He knew he was not just collecting wood, he was collecting the very essence of a people's spiritual beliefs, their grief, and their obligations to the dead. His journey was a stark contrast to the world he had left behind. In New York, life was ordered, predictable, and safe. In New Guinea, every day was a struggle against the elements. The sweltering heat was relentless, the jungle was a labyrinth of unseen dangers, and the rivers were powerful and unpredictable arteries of life and death. Yet Michael seemed to thrive in this environment. He felt a sense of purpose and freedom he had never known. He was no longer just Nelson Rockefeller's son. He was an explorer, an adventurer charting his own course. It was this deep, personal quest for meaning, set against the backdrop of one of the world's most formidable landscapes, that would ultimately seal his fate. The Asmat people inhabited the swampy coastal plains of southwestern New Guinea, a world of mud, mangroves, and sprawling river systems. Their entire existence was intricately woven with the spirit world, a realm populated by the ghosts of ancestors who remained a powerful presence among the living. The Asmat believed that the physical and spiritual worlds were inseparable. For them, every tree, river, and creature possessed a spirit. Their art, rituals, and social structure were all designed to maintain a delicate balance with these unseen forces. To be Asmat was to live in constant dialogue with the dead, to honor their memory, and to fulfill the sacred obligations they left behind for the next generation. Central to Asmat culture was a cycle of reciprocity, which extended to life and death. Headhunting was not a savage or random act of violence. It was a deeply ingrained cultural and spiritual necessity. When a person died, their spirit lingered, causing disharmony and demanding retribution. The only way to restore cosmic balance and appease the restless ghost was to take a head from an enemy village. The act of headhunting was therefore a sacred duty, a way of repaying a debt to the spirit world. The name of the victim was often given to a newborn child, ensuring that the life force or spiritual essence of the deceased was brought back into the community, completing a vital cycle. This practice was also entwined with cannibalism. For the Asmat, consuming parts of a slain enemy was the ultimate act of capturing their power and essence. It was a way of absorbing their strength and, in a symbolic sense, becoming them. This was not about sustenance, but about spiritual transference. These rituals were fundamental to their identity and their understanding of the universe. However, the arrival of Dutch colonial authorities in the mid-20th century brought sudden and violent change. The Dutch, viewing headhunting as barbaric, sought to eradicate it. In 1958, just a few years before Michael's arrival, a Dutch patrol had brutally massacred several men from the village of Otsianep in retaliation for a headhunting raid, creating deep-seated resentment and a powerful, unavenged grievance. The people of Otsianep were left in a state of profound spiritual imbalance. According to their beliefs, the ghosts of the men killed by the Dutch patrol were now haunting the village, demanding revenge. But how could they take the heads of the powerful white men who carried firearms? The Asmat were caught between the demands of their ancestral traditions and the violent imposition of a new colonial order. This simmering tension, this unfulfilled obligation to their dead, created a volatile atmosphere along the coast. It was into this complex and dangerous cultural landscape, a world of spirits, sacred duties, and a burning desire for revenge, that Michael Rockefeller would unknowingly venture. On November 18, 1961, Michael Rockefeller and a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing were traveling down the coast of the Arafura Sea. They were aboard a makeshift catamaran, a dugout canoe that had been modified with an outboard motor and lashed to another hull for stability. Their destination was the village of Otsianep, a community known for its particularly skilled carvers and its strong adherence to traditional ways. Michael was eager to acquire some of their unique artifacts for his collection. The sea was calm at first, but as they moved further from the mouth of the Islandan River, the weather began to turn. The sky darkened, and the water grew choppy and unpredictable. Suddenly, without warning, a powerful wave struck their vessel. The overloaded and top-heavy catamaran shuddered violently, and then capsized, throwing Michael, Wassing, and their two local guides into the churning sea. They managed to cling to the overturned hull as the current began to pull them further and further out into open water. For hours, they drifted helplessly, the coastline a distant, tantalizing silhouette. The two guides, both experienced locals, decided to swim for shore to get help. They were strong swimmers, familiar with the treacherous currents, and they bravely struck out, eventually reaching safety and raising the alarm. As day turned into night and then into another morning, Michael and Wassing remained with the wreckage, their hopes of a quick rescue fading with the passing hours. They were miles from shore, exhausted and dehydrated. The current was relentlessly pulling them further out to sea. Michael, ever the optimist and a strong swimmer himself, began to grow impatient. He watched the distant shoreline, estimating it to be a few miles away. He believed he could make it. Wassing, who was older and less confident in the water, pleaded with him to stay with the boat, arguing that a search party was surely on its way. But Michael's resolve was firm. Around 8 o'clock in the morning on November 19th, he made a fateful decision. He stripped down to his underwear, tied 2 empty gasoline cans to his belt for buoyancy, and turned to Wassing. His last recorded words were, "I think I can make it." He then slipped into the water and began to swim toward the faint outline of the jungle. Wassing watched as his companion grew smaller and smaller, a tiny speck moving with determined strokes toward the distant shore, until he finally disappeared from view. Michael Rockefeller was never officially seen again. He had vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness of New Guinea. In the wake of Michael's disappearance, one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of the South Pacific was launched. The Rockefeller family's immense influence was brought to bear. Dutch naval ships, airplanes, and helicopters scoured the coastline and the Arafura Sea for any sign of the missing heir. His father Nelson and his twin sister Mary flew to New Guinea to oversee the desperate search, their presence turning a remote tragedy into a global news story. For days the world held its breath, hoping for a miracle. But after 9 days of exhaustive searching, no trace of Michael was ever found. No body, no clothing, no gasoline cans. The Dutch colonial government, facing intense international pressure, quickly concluded its investigation. The official story was simple, tragic, and plausible. Michael Rockefeller had drowned. They declared that he had either succumbed to exhaustion while trying to swim to shore, been pulled under by the treacherous currents, or fallen victim to a shark or a saltwater crocodile. It was a clean and convenient explanation. It portrayed Michael as a brave but reckless adventurer who had been tragically claimed by the unforgiving sea. This narrative closed the case, offered a semblance of an answer to a grieving family, and crucially, avoided any suggestion of a more complicated or disturbing truth that might tarnish the image of the colony. However, almost immediately, a different story began to circulate. A darker, more troubling narrative that whispered through the mission stations and tribal villages of the Asmat coast. This alternative account claimed that Michael had not drowned. It insisted that he had successfully made it to shore, exhausted but alive, only to meet a horrifying fate at the hands of the Asmat warriors of Otsianep. According to these rumors, the warriors, who were still seeking revenge for the 1958 massacre by the Dutch, saw Michael's arrival as a divine opportunity. Here was a white man, a member of the powerful Tuan tribe, delivered to them by the sea. They saw him not as an individual but as a symbol. This version of events suggested that the warriors of Otsianep killed Michael as part of a ritual headhunting raid. It was not an act of personal malice but a sacred obligation to restore the balance that had been shattered by the Dutch patrol. By taking the head of a white man, they could finally appease the ghosts of their slain relatives. This story, passed down through oral traditions and reported by missionaries who had spent years among the Asmat, painted a far more complex and gruesome picture. It transformed Michael's disappearance from a tragic accident into a story of cultural collision, ritual violence, and a desperate, unfulfilled quest for revenge. The official story of drowning was neat, but it failed to account for a growing body of contradictory evidence that pointed toward the alternative narrative. Much of this came from Catholic missionaries who lived and worked closely with the Asmat people. One priest, Father Cornelius van Kessel, reported hearing from his parishioners that warriors from Otsianep had killed a white man who had swum ashore. They described how they had speared him, taken his head, and performed the ritual cannibalism that their traditions demanded. The details were specific and chilling. They even spoke of dividing up his belongings and using his bones to make tools and weapons, a common practice in their culture. These missionary reports were initially dismissed by the Dutch authorities, who were eager to avoid a scandal. Admitting that a Rockefeller had been killed and cannibalized by a tribe under their jurisdiction would be a colossal embarrassment. It would undermine their claims of having pacified the region and brought civilization to its people. The cover-up seemed deliberate. The Dutch government wanted the story to be about the dangers of the sea, not the persistence of headhunting. They silenced the missionaries and officially closed the investigation, leaving the rumors to fester in the humid jungle air for decades. Years later, in 2014, a new piece of potential evidence surfaced. Carl Hoffman, an author investigating the case for his book Savage Harvest, uncovered a previously overlooked piece of film footage. Shot by an adventure journalist in 1969, years after Michael's disappearance, the film shows a group of Asmat warriors in a canoe. Among them is a light-skinned man with a beard, paddling alongside the natives. Some observers, including photographic experts, noted a striking resemblance to Michael Rockefeller. Could he have somehow survived and been assimilated into the tribe? While tantalizing, the theory was highly speculative and the man's identity was never confirmed. It added another layer of myth to an already dense mystery. The most compelling evidence, however, remains the oral testimonies of the Asmat people themselves, collected over many years by different investigators. They spoke of the killing not with shame but as a necessary act dictated by their worldview. For them, Michael's death was part of a cosmic transaction, a balancing of the spiritual scales. They explained how the village had been haunted by the ghosts of those killed by the Dutch, and that killing Michael was the only way to bring peace to their community. The story of what happened to the Tuan with the glasses became part of their history, a cautionary tale passed down through generations, long after the outside world had accepted the official story of his drowning. The reasons for concealing the truth about Michael Rockefeller's fate were complex and deeply rooted in the politics of the era. For the Dutch colonial authorities, the primary motive was control and reputation. The Netherlands was already facing international pressure to decolonize New Guinea. Admitting that a prominent American citizen had been killed under their watch would have been a catastrophic failure of governance. It would expose their control over the territory as fragile and incomplete, and paint the Asmat people as savages in need of continued colonial rule, a narrative that was becoming increasingly unpalatable on the world stage. It was far simpler and politically safer to blame the unforgiving ocean. The Rockefeller family also had powerful reasons to prefer the story of drowning over the gruesome alternative. Nelson Rockefeller was a man of immense public stature with soaring political ambitions. The story of his son being killed and cannibalized was not just a personal tragedy, it was a public relations nightmare. It was a story that could be sensationalized, mocked, and used against him by political rivals. The image of a Rockefeller falling victim to a primitive tribe clashed violently with the family's cultivated image of power, control, and modernity. A heroic death at sea was a far more dignified and manageable narrative for a family that lived its life in the public eye. Furthermore, a confirmation of the headhunting story would have likely demanded retribution. The American public and press might have called for a punitive expedition against the village of Otsianep, leading to more violence and bloodshed. This was something that both the Dutch government and arguably the Rockefeller family wanted to avoid. Nelson Rockefeller, in his grief, may have understood that his son had entered a world with its own rules and dangers. Pursuing vengeance would only perpetuate the cycle of violence that had, in a tragic and indirect way, led to Michael's death. Accepting the drowning narrative was a way to let the tragedy end, at least publicly. This convergence of interests, the Dutch government's need to save face, the Rockefeller family's desire to protect its image and avoid further conflict, and the sheer difficulty of proving what happened in such a remote place, created a powerful conspiracy of silence. The truth, or at least the most likely version of it, was buried under layers of official denial and private grief. The story of Michael Rockefeller became a casualty not only of a cultural clash in the jungles of New Guinea, but also of the cold, pragmatic calculations of power in the corridors of Washington and The Hague, leaving the full story untold for more than half a century. Today, more than 60 years after he swam away from his overturned boat, the mystery of Michael Rockefeller endures. He has become a figure of modern mythology, a ghost haunting the swamplands of New Guinea. His story is a captivating blend of adventure, tragedy, and the unknown, a tale of a young man from one of the world's most powerful families who was swallowed by one of its most remote and least understood cultures. The official cause of death remains drowning, but the whispers from the jungle have grown into a compelling and widely accepted alternative narrative. The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky waters where these two stories meet, a truth that may never be fully confirmed. The disappearance of Michael Rockefeller serves as a powerful and humbling lesson about the profound gap that can exist between different cultures. Michael approached the Asmat with respect and curiosity, yet he could not fully comprehend the deep spiritual forces that governed their world. He was an outsider who, through a tragic accident of fate, stumbled into a pre-existing drama of revenge and spiritual obligation. The Asmat, in turn, saw him not as an individual anthropologist named Michael, but as a representative of the white tribe that had brought violence and imbalance to their community. His death, if it occurred as the tribesmen say, was the result of a tragic, violent, and irreconcilable misunderstanding. His story also highlights how history is often shaped and sanitized by those in power. The official narrative was constructed to serve political and personal interests, burying a more complicated and unsettling truth. It reminds us that the histories we read are often incomplete, curated to present a version of events that is palatable and convenient. The real story often survives only in the margins, in the oral traditions of the disenfranchised, the hushed reports of missionaries, and the determined work of investigators willing to challenge the accepted version of the past. The Rockefeller case reveals the mechanisms of silence and denial that can obscure the truth for decades. In the end, Michael Rockefeller's quest for the authentic and the elemental led him to his doom. He sought to escape the shadow of his name, and in the jungles of New Guinea, he found a place where it meant nothing and everything. He became an unwitting participant in a ritual he could not have understood, his fate forever entwined with the people and the art he so admired. His disappearance is more than just an unsolved mystery. It is a timeless and cautionary tale about the limits of understanding, the persistence of ancient traditions in a modernizing world, and the enduring power of the stories we tell about the ghosts we leave behind.